tonight, God willing, we're going to try and get through Ruth chapter 2 and Ruth chapter 3. The story so far, if you missed last week, from Ruth chapter 1 is that Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 sons left Israel to go to Moab. And then in Moab, Elimelech dies, and the sons marry Orpah and Ruth, 2 Moabitish women. Then the sons die, and then Naomi realizes her position and decides to return to Israel. And Orpah turns back to go to Moab, but Ruth sticks with Naomi, and they come to Israel, having dedicated themselves to the God of Israel. And now they're there in Israel. They're facing poverty, as it were, because there's no means for them to get any food. They can't work. There's no man about the house, so to speak. But they have come at a wonderful time. We read in verse 22 of chapter 1 that Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. So they come at this great time of harvest and the crops being taken from the fields. And at this time, you see, in Israel, was the time of the Passover. So not only was it a great time of celebration from a practical and a natural perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective, what was being celebrated in the culture of the Israelites at the time was the deliverance from Israel. And you can imagine Naomi and Ruth entering into this as they had been delivered, as it were, from Moab. And so they would have been on a spiritual high. You know, I often think it's sad in a way that we don't keep some of the holy days of Israel. I have heard of some Christadelphians doing it, because they're there in God's law to remind Israel of certain things. And sometimes we don't have that because of our Gentile culture. But they would have entered into the spirit of the Passover at this time. And we find then them dwelling in the land of Israel at this time of harvest. Now in verse 1 of chapter 2, we're introduced by the divine storyteller to Boaz. We read with Brother Vic, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Now this is a statement of fact. Naomi didn't really know this, it seems, nor did Ruth. But we're told this right at the start because as the story unfolds, we see that this is a key part of the story, and it lends weight to the drama of the situation. You see, there was this kinsman, a blood relative, related to Elimelech. And he wasn't a close one. The word kinsman there in verse 1, it just means, it could even mean an acquaintance, but in the context we see, it does mean a distant relative. And he was of the family or the kindred of Elimelech. And you may have mentioned last time, we mentioned the law of the brother, and how important that law is going to become in our studies will become apparent. The Levirate law. And the whole point of it, and we'll look at it briefly in a bit, is that the line of the dead was to continue by a brother marrying his brother's wife after the original brother had died. And so we're being told something quite important here, that there was a marriage hope, as it were, unbeknown to Naomi and to Ruth in verse 1, through this man Boaz. Now it calls Boaz various things. It says that he was a mighty man of wealth. And that word wealth, it means virtue. He was a man of means. And where it says there, the mighty man is a man of virtue. And when it says of wealth, that really kind of gives the idea of strength and substance. This was a rich man. And Boaz, the name Boaz, it's difficult for the linguists. Some of them, the best I could find was fleetness. He was quick, as it were. He was fast. And we see later on that he was actually quite an elderly man, in comparison to Ruth at least. And so we have this wealthy man presented in verse 1, and then we jump back to reality with a bump in verse 2. Almost in complete opposite to this man, we have Ruth, the dirty foreigner. We have Ruth, the Moabitess, who has come in from Moab. And we see that Ruth and Naomi, they're in poverty, because Ruth says in verse 2, "Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace." And she said unto her, "Go, my daughter." And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Now look at the character of Ruth here. She is a stranger in a foreign land, so to speak. She's faced with this problem. They need food. And she takes up the initiative for her mother-in-law. And she says, "Look, I'm going to go to the field and gather ears of corn." And she doesn't presume. She says, "After him in whose sight I shall find grace." She doesn't shirk from her responsibilities. This is a young lady who is trying to do the right thing by her family. And this isn't just a practical problem, brothers and sisters, because what she's doing here is actually following the law of Moses and the provision that God had given for the poor. So perhaps we could have a quick look at some of the provisions in the law for the poor. If you go to Leviticus chapter 19, you'll see that Ruth was indeed, she must have been reading or at least aware of the law of Moses and the principles which governed it. So Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 9 says, "And when ye reap in the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am Yahweh your God." So what we're reading there is that the edges of the fields were to be left for the poor, for the stranger. And it's connected directly, isn't it, with the God that we worship. I am Yahweh. In other words, this is my provision, says God, for the poor, the stranger. This is God's love. This is God's mercy. This is the kingdom law for the poor so that they can eat. And it was showing, wasn't it, the fact that the Israelites were not to be greedy. They were not to get every single grape off their tree. Beat it down, get what you can, but if you leave one, leave it there for the poor people. And Ruth was poor. She was a stranger. She was, as it were, humanly speaking, in a pretty hopeless situation, in poverty, as it were. I am Yahweh. It's God's mercy. And you can imagine Ruth becoming aware of these things and thinking, well, this is how God has provided for someone like me. And accepting that was the case. But notice when she spoke, she didn't even presume. She didn't bring this up as her right to glean in these fields. She says, if I find favor in the eyes of someone, then I'll do this. Beautiful attitude. Let's flick on to let's just skip past Leviticus 23. Let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And we again see this principle coming out and the love of God in providing for those who are less well off in Israel. Deuteronomy 24, if you read verse 19, it says, "When thou cuttest down thine harvest in the field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that Yahweh thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands." And look at verse 22. "And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt before I command thee to do this thing." And you just wonder, don't you, that because they were celebrating Passover at this time, whether these passages had been read by Ruth. And this is what triggered her motivation at this time, to think this is how God has provided for the poor. And so I'm going to go and see if there's a field that I can glean in behind. And maybe someone might forget some sheaves in that field and we can eat. My dear mother-in-law, Naomi. And so we see God's providence at work, and she is allowed to go, and she decides, as it were, it says in verse 3 of chapter 2 of Ruth, that her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. An unforeseen chance, so to speak, the Hebrew seems to mean from that. It was unforeseen to her that she was choosing a field that was owned by Boaz, who happened to be a distant blood relative to her husband, who was now dead. So Ruth follows the spirit of God's word, and God works with this. Now, she starts to work, doesn't she, in this field. And we see in verse 4 that Boaz comes from Bethlehem. I wonder what he was doing there. You know, it's very interesting. He may have been taking the first fruits of the crop and had been offering that as the sheaf of first fruits, as it says in Leviticus 23, and that's why he wasn't there at this time. We just don't know. But he comes, and he comes from Bethlehem out to his fields, and he's got these people working for him. It seems he's got two types of people. He's got the reapers, who are the guys going to chop the crop, and then he's got maidens and other servants that follow after to pick up the things and gather up and bind the sheaves that they've cut to bring them into storage. And look what he says to the reapers. He says there in verse 4, Yahweh be with you. And they answered him, Yahweh bless thee. So the thing we notice about this is a godly man, isn't it? And the people in his employment are also godly. And we think, hang on a second, because isn't this Bethlehem, Judah at the time of the judges? Isn't this the time when every man did that which was right in his own eyes? And suddenly we realize that even in the corrupted culture of Israel, there's a remnant there. And Boaz is part of that faithful remnant, as there always is. Now notice what he says there. It's quite beautiful, really. The Lord bless thee. The Hebrew is Yahweh Barak. And I think it's a compounded quote from Numbers chapter 6. Yahweh bless thee, Yahweh barak thee, and keep thee. Yahweh make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. The divine blessing to Aaron. And his employees are echoing this back to him, and he's echoing it to them. Now, I don't know if you noticed this. I wasn't going to turn it, but quickly flick over to Psalm 129. I don't know if you noticed this on Monday. Ruth and I were doing our readings, and it just jumped out and hit me in the eye. You know, as it does when you're in the middle of another study, how things connect. I don't know if you noticed this when you did your readings on Monday, but it says here in Psalm 129, it's a song of degrees, and it's messianic. It says in verse 3, the ploughers ploughed upon my back, they made long their furrows. It says in verse 4, Yahweh is righteous, he hath cut asunder the cords of the wicked. Let them all be confounded and turned back that hate Zion. And so we get this curse upon the wicked, those that hate God's ways. Notice what it says in verse 7, wherewith the mower filleth not his hand, nor he that bindeth sheaves his bosom. Neither do they which go by say, the blessing of Yahweh be upon you. We bless you in the name of Yahweh, Yahweh Barak. And what this is a curse on the wicked. And what the psalmist is praying for is that the wicked are confounded, and that their blessing, they're not blessed in their harvests. And he's saying, I hope that these wicked people do not have the opportunity to say, Yahweh has blessed us. And it's the same language as Ruth chapter 2. It's an inverted comment on the blessings that Boaz and his employees were reflecting to each other. A greeting of harvest, then, is this message that they say, it seems. So Boaz is here. He's in this fruitful field. The name of Yahweh is being spoken of. And he sets his, he looks up and he sees the work that's going on. And he says in verse 5, "Whose damsel is this?" in reference to Ruth. That's the most peculiar thing to say, don't you think? Because he could say, "Who is this young damsel?" But he doesn't. He says, "Whose is this young damsel?" So there's something about this woman that makes him think that she belongs, as it were, to somebody else. Now, I'll just suggest this to you, because it will come up later, but I wonder if she was wearing her widow's garments at this moment in time. And that's why he says, well, whose is this damsel? In other words, who's died that she's come to glean in our fields? Just a suggestion, which I'll come back to in just a minute. But the point is that Boaz was a caring man, wasn't he? He takes notice of things. And he cares. Who is this that has become so poor that they have come here? And the servant says in verse 6, the lead servant that was over the reapers, he says, "It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house." Now, you can see here some very interesting things. Everybody knew about, it seems, about Naomi, because it says, do you remember in chapter 1, that the whole of Bethlehem came out and was moved about them in verse 19 of chapter 1. So they kind of knew what was going on. And it just so happens that this person that Boaz probably had heard about has now come and is gleaning in his field. But not just that. She isn't just coming to glean the edges. She's not just coming to check if anybody's left anything. She's actually had a bit of ambition, because she's asked the reapers if she could actually come and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she's coming up afterwards, after they've been binding them, and she's not waiting for them to leave the field. She's right there. She's among the sheaves, and they've let her do it. Now, Boaz finds out then that this was the Moabitish woman, the foreigner, who's come, who's dedicated herself to a life in Israel and the God of Israel. Now, this would have been incredibly significant on a personal level to Boaz. And we'll find that he has a very deep connection with this foreign woman. And he really goes overboard to make her feel welcome. So why does he have this deep connection? Well, I wonder if we could just come over to the New Testament and have a quick look at the genealogy of our Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1. Because we have revealed there a very interesting detail. So in Matthew chapter 1, we read in verse 1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we immediately see that the Lord Jesus Christ is a descendant of David, a descendant of Abraham. He is the promised seed of the new covenant. And we have his genealogy set out. And in verse 5 we read, "And Salmon begat Booz, or Boaz, of Rahab, or Rahab. And Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse." So just look at that, because we read that the father of Boaz was Salmon, and Salmon had married Rahab. Who was Rahab? Well, Rahab was the one, you remember, when the children of Israel are coming out of the promised land, they come, they've done the wilderness wanderings, they come to the first city, Jericho, and in that city they send out the spies, do you remember? And the spies have to hide, and Rahab, the harlot, she takes them in. And for that, do you remember, she's blessed. And the reason she takes them in is because she's heard and has faith in the God of Israel, of Yahweh. And that was Boaz's mum. In Hebrews, we read, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believe not, when she had received the spies with peace. In James chapter 2, we read Rahab the harlot justified by works when she had received the messenger. And in Joshua chapter 6, we read that Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive and her father's household and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. A faithful woman, a woman of faith, was Boaz's mother, but she was a stranger, wasn't she? She wasn't of Israel. She was a harlot. Yes, she had been involved in the salvation of Israel and the spies, but do you think that in all parts of Jewish society, Rahab would have been welcomed in with open arms, a harlot, a dirty foreigner? I think Boaz knew all about prejudice. It's just human nature, isn't it? Maybe that's why he wasn't married, the son of a harlot, a stranger's daughter. But we find that this man Boaz, you see, that experience, whatever that may have been that God had been working in his life, that experience led him to have a different outlook to these things. And sometimes, you think, you suffer things in life and things don't seem to be going the same way as other people. And sometimes we have no idea why. But it might just be that God's working in your life to give you a different perspective. And I think that's what's happening here, because when Boaz finds out, if we flip back to Ruth chapter 2, we find he goes overboard to make this young foreign girl welcome. He says in verse 8, "Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens." Don't go anywhere else. Make yourself at home in my fields. He calls her his daughter. She's a Moabite. That wouldn't have been culturally acceptable, would it? And he's like this father figure to her. And he says there, abide, he says at the end of verse 8, abide here fast. It's the same word in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 14, where it says that Ruth clave to Naomi. They abode together, they stuck together. And he's telling Ruth not to go anywhere else. In verse 9 we read he's told all these young men not to touch her, which shows how vulnerable she may have been and perhaps hints at the wickedness that actually did still exist in Bethlehem, Judah. And he says to her in verse 9, if you get thirsty, it's very thirsty work in the heat of the day, we've got some water for you as well. So he's going overboard, isn't he? He's gushing over to make her feel welcome. I ask the question, brothers and sisters, how welcoming are we when a stranger comes in amongst us? How interested are we actually in them? I'm not talking about saying, hello, how are you? This is somebody who's really trying to help practically this new member, as it were, of the ecclesia in his time. In verse 10, we read of Ruth's reaction to this abundance of niceness from Boaz. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? She's very conscious, isn't she, of her background. And the implication of what she says there is that other people weren't taking knowledge of her. Other people didn't care about her. Why are you, Boaz? Why are you? And notice what Boaz says in verse 11 and 12. He says unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knowest not heretofore. Yahweh recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of Yahweh God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. So Boaz recognizes three things, doesn't he, there? He recognizes her care for Naomi through the gleaning, assumedly, and the hard work she was putting in. and the fact that she'd asked to come right up to glean amongst the sheaves. He recognized that wasn't a selfish thing or a greedy thing. She's trying to help her mother-in-law. The second thing he notices is that she's left father and mother and the land of her nativity. She's abandoned everything she knew. And she's come, the third thing he notices, to a people that she didn't know. But underlying all of it in verse 12, he realizes that this is not just a simple kind of practical thing. He realizes and he understands that she has dedicated herself to the God of Israel, because he says that he wishes that God gives her a reward, as it were, under whose wings thou art come to trust. This was a conversion from Ruth. He understands this. She'd sacrificed everything and she was facing hardship, and this meant a lot to him. He realized what she'd gone through. Now, this little statement of Boaz's is in the center, verse 11 and 12, of one of those chiastic structures that we mentioned the other week. The chiastic structure is where you get repeated words and phrases which lead into a central point. And the words of Boaz sit smack bang in the center of the chiastic structure. And so God's word, through his Spirit, is highlighting that this is one of the key points he wants us to take away from this passage. I can give this to anyone at the end if they want. Those three things: the mother-in-law, the father and mother, and they left the land. And notice that he's not commenting on what she looks like, or how he's commenting on what she's done. You see, it's what we do in life that makes us the people that we are. It's not who we think we might be, or the clothes that we wear, or the style of hair that we have. It's what we do that counts. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, said Jesus. If we're to be converted to Christ, we have to leave behind those things. We looked at this last week. Boaz recognizes this, that all those phrases are found in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Thou hast left thy father and thy mother, the land of thy nativity. All those word connections carry through to the life of Abraham, when Abraham left behind his country and his kindred and his father's house to go to a land. And Boaz is connecting these things to Ruth, the Moabitess. You see, Boaz saw what was going on here. He saw the love that Ruth had for the things of God. He says he wishes that she had a full reward. Again, in the life of Abraham, we get in Genesis 15. Fear not, Abraham, God says, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And he uses the memorial name of Yahweh, God of Israel. And in Exodus 3, verse 15, that's the name that God revealed himself to Israel under. He who will be. And in the name we know is the principle of God manifestation. So Boaz understands that this was a conversion from Ruth. This was a woman dedicated to the things of Israel. No one else understood this, really, by implication. Boaz sees it, though, perhaps because of his background and his experiences growing up under Rahab the harlot. He says that she's trusted in the God of Israel, under whose wings she had come to trust. There's a beautiful passage in Deuteronomy 32, where God says that he found him in a desert land and in the waste howling wilderness. This is Israel. He led him about, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye, as an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them, beareth them on her wings. And you get the picture that there's God who's like an eagle, who has taken her young under her wings to protect them and to help them along. And this phrase is beautiful. It's picked up later in the Psalms. We haven't got time to go through all of these Psalms. A lot of them connect to the context that you find here in Ruth, of somebody completely dedicating themselves to God, who trust in the shadow of God's wings. It's a beautiful phrase, I would suggest. Now, how much do we trust, brothers and sisters, in the shadow of God's wings? Do we even recognize they're above us as we go about our daily lives? Because if we don't even recognize God's protective care, then how can we trust in the shadow of his wings? We have to believe, don't we? And we have to behave in a way that reflects these beautiful things. Now, in verse 14, we read that there's a mealtime, and we read of Boaz inviting Ruth to come and eat bread and dip her morsel in vinegar. A fellowship meal of bread and wine is being conducted at the end of the day in this house of bread, as it were, that Boaz is the leader of. And by implication, she wasn't sitting with everybody else. So he invites her to come up hither, as it were, to partake of this fellowship meal. And she says to him, she says, well, actually, he gets up as well. She sat beside the reapers, and he actually goes even a step further, and it seems that he takes a delicacy, parched corn, and he actually personally gives it to her to eat. And it says, and she was sufficed and left. And some translations have, and she ate and was satisfied, but kept some back. And we'll find later that she saved a bit for Naomi. But she's making a massive impression on Boaz. Because in verse 15, when she'd risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not." Not only that, she wasn't even allowed to come right up to the sheaves, but he says in verse 16, "And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not." So we find again this Boaz, how he's going over and above to look after this stranger who had found her way into his field. And so in verse 17, she gleans all day until evening. Not only does she do that, it's hard work obviously, but we find that after the sun's gone down, she beats out that she had gleaned, which means that she, you know how it works, there's husks around the corn. She beat and threshed, as it were, the produce that she'd got, in order that the beautiful seeds were left, the useful bits of the harvest. So she's a very hard worker. And it says there that she had left about an ephah of barley. And it's a bit tricky to put this in modern terms because it's a liquid measurement. But you know those water canisters that you see in offices sometimes? Well, the top of one of them contains 20 litres of water. So it was about that amount. I don't know what the weight of that is in barley grain, but you can imagine it was quite heavy. So she's been hard at work going through. Now she comes back to Naomi in verse 18, and she shows her mother-in-law what's happened, and she says to her in verse 19, "Where have you been?" And Ruth says to Naomi, "The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz." Now this must have clicked something in Naomi's head. Boaz. And she says, "Blessed be he of Yahweh, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead." So she thanks God for Boaz. And she says, thanks be to God that the living and the dead have been taken care of. Now what do you think that means? Well, I think the living obviously means those that are alive at the time. So Ruth, Naomi, possibly even Boaz himself. And the dead, what does it mean by the dead being looked after or blessed by God? Well, surely that means Mahlon, Elimelech, those that had died. They're being looked after. So I think what Naomi is saying, something's clicked in her head and she's realizing God's behind this. Something's going on here. That the dead are being looked after somehow. And she says at the end, "The man is a near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen." Now we're going to look at this a little bit in our final study, But the word kinsman there is ga'al. It means the redeemer. He's a redeemer. He's part of this levirate law. And he is able to continue the seed of the dead. And verse 21, Ruth the Moabitess said, he said also unto me, thou shalt keep fast by my young men. And so Ruth's now realizing something else is going on here. He's being overly nice to us. And Naomi says in verse 22, it is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in any other field. She can see the hand of God. They can see where this might be going. And so Naomi is saying, don't go anywhere else. And so in verse 23, we read that the harvest time continues on day after day. Naomi goes out to glean in Boaz's fields. And he obviously would have got to know her a bit more, and there would have been, no doubt, many discussions that took place between Ruth, and the gleaners. Now, it's interesting just to consider that in Ruth chapter 2, the key word peppered throughout in verse 2, verse 3, verse 7, verse 8, verse 15, verse 16, verse 17, 18, 19, and 23, the key word there is glean. It's all about gleaning. It's all about gathering in the fruit of God's blessing. Beautiful Psalm 104. O Yahweh, how manifold are thy works. These wait all upon thee, that thou mayest give them their meat in due season, that thou givest them, they gather or glean. Thou openest thine hand, they are filled with good. So we all gather, don't we, from God's provision. And that's why we say thanks at meals. I think we'd perhaps appreciate it a little more if we actually had to go out in a field and literally glean it, wouldn't we? So perhaps we must remember this next time we sit down to a meal, that this is all God's provision. He has opened his hand and allowed some of the provender, as it were, to spill out so that we can gather it. And aren't we thankful for his blessings? As we say, just a quick reminder of where this is going. I always say this wrong, so I should just call it the law of the brother. That law in the law of Moses, we're going to look at it next time in a bit more detail. When a husband died and was childless, his next of kin was to marry the husband's wife. This would have carried on the line of descent and also allowed for the inheritance of the family to continue to the next generation. Perhaps actually we could just turn to Deuteronomy 25 just to see a little bit of this law just before we go into chapter 3 of Ruth. Deuteronomy 25 verse 5 says, if brethren dwell together, one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. Now, by this law, you see, and by the fact that there was a blood relative, not a direct brother, as it were, but a distant relative, Ruth now, we find, has a right, as it were, legally, of obtaining a husband of the male relatives of Elimelech, who was still alive. And Naomi connects this. So if you turn to Ruth chapter 3 again, we find that this has been whirring around Naomi's mind. She knows that Boaz has a soft spot for Ruth. She obviously realizes that Ruth looks up to this wonderful man who's full of the blessings of God and full of care and interest in her. And she perhaps also knows that Boaz would never make a move on Ruth because he was an older man, you see. And so Naomi, the mother-in-law, as mother-in-laws tend to do, sorry, Christine, she has a plan, and she gets the plan started by giving Ruth a few ideas, right? So she hatches this plan, and it's a bit of a strange plan, if we're honest. It has to be a secret, that's the first thing. And she says in let's just read verses 1 to 3. She says, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the threshing floor. Wash thyself, therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the floor. But make not thyself known unto the man, until he shall have done eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lieth down, that thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie, and thou shalt go in and uncover his feet, and lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do. And she said unto her, All that thou sayest unto me, I will do. Now in verse 1, she's saying, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee? And I think it was Brother Simon in the comments last week mentioned that this Hebrew word manawak, rest, it's actually a word that's already been used in Ruth chapter 1, verse 9, where Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth, before they come back to Israel, she says that Yahweh grant you that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. And she's saying, go back and get married in Moab. And that's going to be like a rest for you. So this is in the context of this, she's actually saying to Ruth, I'm seeking a marriage for you, Ruth. I'm seeking a rest for you. Now, it might be strange to connect marriage to rest, but it is, isn't it? It's a lovely thing when two people are very content with each other, working together in the bonds of the truth, in union. And that's what Naomi wants for Ruth. And we see that she's worked out this law, okay? But then she has this very strange and peculiar plan. She tells Ruth she's got to prepare. She says, wash, get anointed, get dressed. She says, go out to where Boaz is winnowing. And that was where they threw up the crop that had been cut down, and the wind blew away the chaff, and the good seeds came down. So it seems to be that on this night, the conditions were such that it was a prime time, and she knew that Boaz, after his employees had gone home, would still be working late and would still be on his own, and would probably go to sleep that very night on his own in the threshing floor. So she says, go along, mark or know where he's going to go to sleep, and then when everyone's gone, as it were, and he's had his food, and he goes down to sleep, you go there, uncover his feet, lie down next to him, at his feet, and then when he wakes up, he'll tell you what to do. You think, I was scratching my head over this for some time, like, what is going on? A lot of the commentaries say this is an ancient custom. What, really? This is something that happened all the time, was it? People just, went to winnowing floors and laid down at other people's feet. I don't think this is necessarily that. It may be, but I don't see any evidence for it. So what's it all about then? Well, in verses 6 and 7, it happens. And in verse 8, we read that poor Boaz is in the middle of the night. See, this wasn't something that happened all the time. He wakes up at midnight and he's afraid. What's going on? He turns himself around and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He's in shock. What is going on? And he says, who are you? In verse 9. She says, I'm Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman, margin, one that hath right to redeem the all. And he says straight away, Blessed be thou of Yahweh, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, insomuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. We see here again in verse 9, you see, Ruth's not presumptuous about these things. She says, I'm one of your handmaids. And Boaz knows exactly what's going on. Immediately he realizes that this is in effect Ruth asking him to marry him. She actually in effect says that. She says, stretch therefore thy skirt The Hebrew for that, interestingly enough, is the Hebrew wings. It's the same word in chapter 2 and verse 12, which says, under whose wings thou art come to trust. The skirt is the same in the Hebrew as the wings. She's saying, I want you to come and protect me like a husband. Now, there's loads going on here, and I don't know quite, we've got a few minutes, I'm going to quickly see what I can do. But my view of this is that actually what is happening here is that Ruth is enacting what happened with Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. Perhaps we could quickly just jump there. We're going to spend more time in the life of Tamar, God willing, next week. But in Genesis chapter 28, we find it's a similar situation in regards to the law of the brother. 38. Now, we haven't got time to go through it all, but you may remember the story that it's not the nicest story. But remember that Tamar gets married and her husband dies. And then her husband's brother dies also. And Judah, who's the dad of the sons that she was marrying, says, well, look, I'll get you a husband. In verse 11, he says, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but the point is this, that when it comes to the time when she is to no longer be mourning as a widow, it's time for her to act. And look what it says in verse 14 that Tamar does. She put off her widow's garments from off her. It was time to stop being a widow. The son that she had been promised was fully grown. And it was time in her eyes to get married properly. Now, just tuck those things away and come back to Ruth chapter 3. What does Naomi say to Ruth? She says, wash thyself therefore, anoint thee, and put thy raiment upon thee. Stop being a widow. The time of mourning for Mahlon is over. I think this is what she's saying. Declare that you're ready to get married. Declare that this is the time for the law of the brother to be enacted, for the near kinsman to do his redeeming work. It's time. You are ready. That's my suggestion. And so when it comes to it, that this is why it had to be in secret, because we're going to find out a little twist in the story, because there's another kinsman even nearer to Boaz. But it had to be done in secret because Ruth wants to tell Boaz straight away, the first person, that she's chosen him to do this work, to be that redeemer for her. It says that in verse 9. She actually says, thou art my redeemer. I'm choosing you. And he gets this, doesn't he? Straight away he says, look, blessed be Yahweh of you, because you're not following the young men. By implication, he's quite old. You're not following the poor or the rich. You found me. And she's saying to him, when she's saying, spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, she's saying, protect me. I want to come under your wings. Now this phrase, spreading of the skirt, it is a language of marriage. You see, God says it in Ezekiel 16 verse 8 to Israel. He says, now when I passed by thee and looked upon thee, behold, thy time was the time of love. And I spread my skirt, my wings over thee, and covered thy nakedness. Yea, I swear unto thee, and entered into a covenant with thee, saith the Lord God, and thou becamest mine. And this whole idea of her coming and uncovering his feet, I think personally was just a practical thing. Because he's fast asleep, and she uncovers his feet to make him cold, as it were, to wake him up. And she just lies there quietly until he wakes up gently, because she doesn't want to make a big fuss. And then she explains the situation, and in God's blessing, he accepts what she's suggesting. And as I say, that same word in the Hebrew for skirt is the same word wings in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 9. And so Boaz is extremely happy, isn't he, in verse 10 to 11. But here's the twist. In verse 12, he's obviously thought this through already. He says in verse 12, "And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit, there is a kinsman nearer than I." And he says, "Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of a kinsman to thee. As Yahweh liveth, lie down until the morning." What a twist in the story. You know, and Boaz is such an honourable man, isn't he? Even though he wants to marry Ruth, he follows the precepts of the law. And so he says, "No, I'm going to sort this out straight away tomorrow." Can you imagine there? It says in verse 14, "She lay at his feet until the morning." Can you imagine that what they talked about all night? You know, they wouldn't have gone to sleep, would they? They would have been talking about well, what if he says he wants to? And they just had to trust in God, didn't they? They just had to trust in God. And just in the morning, as the sun comes up, we read that Boaz, they must have been talking, because Boaz says, "Bring a veil," and he gives her loads of barley that he'd obviously been winnowing that night. And he says, "Go and take it home to Naomi." In other words, thank you, Naomi, for this. Really appreciate it. And then we read of how she comes back and she explains to Naomi what's happened. In verse 18, Naomi says, "Sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall." She was obviously not sitting still and jumping all around the place with excitement. She couldn't cope with this near kinsman twist in the plot. What if this other guy says, "Yes, he wants to be my husband"? Naomi says, "Sit still, trust in God, and we'll see how the matter will fall. For Boaz will not rest until he have finished this thing." What an exciting and beautiful and romantic story we have before us then, brothers and sisters. The key word in Ruth chapter 3, you know, as we've gone through all the chapters, there's always a word that kind of peppers each chapter. The key word in Ruth 3 is the word "no." It's in verse 3, verse 4, verse 11, verse 14, verse 18, and actually finishes up chapter 4, verse 4. And in Psalm 46, verse 10, it says, "Be still, sit still, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth." Now, Boaz calls Ruth a virtuous woman. And in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 4, we read, "A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. But she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones." And so we have, as it is in the Proverbs, this parallelism. We have a woman that makes her husband feel rotten, and we have this virtuous woman who is a beautiful crown to her husband. The word for virtuous means a woman of substance, spiritual substance. A character of a godly virtue is the ideas that come out. And that should be a key, young people, the key thing that you look for in a marriage partner. Note these words, young men. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Note that word, young ladies. Virtuous. Now, can we quickly turn? We're not going to go through it, but we're just going to pick out a couple of quick points from Proverbs chapter 31. What does it mean to be a virtuous woman? Well, in Proverbs chapter 31, we have a description of the virtuous woman. And it's well worth studying and looking through if you get time, and pondering each of the sayings that are said about a virtuous woman. Look at verse 10. "Who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life." And as we go through the verses, we realize that she's a hard-working woman. She looks after her family. She's a worker. It's not what she thinks she's doing. It's not what she's saying. It's not what she looks like that makes her virtuous. It's what she does. It's not the things that we say that make us. It's the things that we do. And as you go through the chapter, there's two levels, as always there is in the Proverbs. There's like a practical, kind of literal level, and there's a deeper, more spiritual level. In verses 13 to 17, she prepares in advance her food for her family. In verse 18, we read that she has this candle that never goes out because she's prepared prepared the light that she needs to have to do her work. You know, as I say, there's a natural level, isn't there, on that? You know, she's got many candles in the cupboard, so to speak. She's prepared. But then there's a spiritual level because her light never goes out. She's always issuing forth godly light. In verses 19 to 25, she works to clothe her household in strength and honour. Look at this in verse 26. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favour is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth Yahweh, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. This is what counts, isn't it, brothers and sisters? We're all to be, if we remain faithful, the bride of Christ. It's not about what we look like, is it? It's not about how beautiful we are on the outside. It's what goes on in the inside. It's a woman that fears Yahweh. That's what we should be looking for, young people, in our marriage partners. Ruth was such a woman, a hard worker. She trusted in God. And what's beautiful about the whole thing is that when we started in Ruth chapter 1, Boaz is a virtuous man, the same as Ruth, just a male version. Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, virtue, same word. And so we have before us these two virtuous people. It was like when they looked at each other, a bit of themselves was looking back, because they were both motivated by the same thing, by godly ways, the common interest in the things of God. They kind of both had that kind of similar background, haven't they, of as it were, maybe prejudice, but holding fast to the things of God. They were both very virtuous. So we'll just finish with our lessons. We should not neglect the poor in our ecclesia. We should seek to welcome in those who have our shared faith, go over and above what we might normally do to show an interest. We should seek to emulate a virtuous, godly character in our lives. And we need to put our trust under the shadow of God's wings and recognize his ways in our lives. In Malachi 4 verse 2, we read, "But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings." And that healing, brothers and sisters, is God willing for us. If we hold fast, if we recognize, like Ruth did, the beauty and the wonder of the God of Israel, under whose wings we have come to trust.